The sky was already fading into a bruised purple when Ada finally reached the small ranch at the edge of nowhere. Her steps were slow, tired, the weight of her burden heavier with every one she took. She barely noticed the cool air biting at her skin. Behind her, the broken wagon rattled with every bump in the ground. Its wheel cracked and useless, and the horse pulling it was nothing more than skin and bone. She didn't know how much longer they could last, but she kept moving. The children, her younger siblings, were exhausted. Tommy, the oldest at 10, was trying to keep them together. His eyes were tired, his hands clenched around the reins as he stared ahead, trying to appear braver than he felt. Sarah, barely 8, was curled up on the back of the wagon, her lips cracked and her face pale. James, the youngest at 6, had fallen asleep sitting up, his small body barely able to stay upright. Ada had tried to keep the wagon moving, to stay ahead of the hunger, the cold, and the storm that was rolling in. But everything had gone wrong. Their mother had died 3 months ago from consumption, a slow death that had taken away more than just her life. It had taken Ada's childhood. Their father, a man who'd once been a farmer with dreams of a better life, had spiraled down into gambling and drinking. He'd lost the farm, sold everything they had, and even tried to sell her off to pay his debts to a saloon owner. That was the last straw. She had stolen their father's wagon and horse in the middle of the night, taken her siblings, and run. For 8 days, they had walked and driven, barely able to find food or water. Ada had kept them going, her own body running on empty, her mind focused only on survival. But now, with the storm closing in and no hope in sight, she had no choice but to stop. She'd seen the barn in the distance, the faint outline of a building against the gathering darkness, and she had known that if she didn't find shelter soon, they'd all be dead by morning. With her heart pounding in her chest, Ada pulled the wagon up in front of the barn and climbed down, legs shaking beneath her. She didn't even look up at the house, but instead walked toward the barn door, the children trailing behind her. She had to be careful, she knew. There was no telling who lived here or what kind of man he might be. But what choice did she have? She could only pray that he was kind. When she knocked, her voice came out thin and desperate. "Please, mister," she said, looking down at the worn-out rags that barely clung to her body. "Just one night, in the barn. We won't be trouble." The man who answered the door was younger than she expected, perhaps in his mid-20s, tall and broad-shouldered. His face was rough, with stubble covering his jaw, but his eyes were steady and calm. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the state of her clothes, the ragged wagon, and the 3 small children standing silently behind her. The wind howled behind her, sending dust swirling through the air, and the temperature dropped rapidly. She could feel the storm coming fast, a vicious thing that would trap them all outside if she didn't find shelter. She swallowed hard, trying not to show how scared she was. Ada started, but her words caught in her throat. The cowboy glanced at the sky, his eyes narrowing as the first raindrops began to fall. He could hear the storm coming, the wind picking up in intensity. He knew what it meant for people caught in weather like this, especially with children. He'd seen it before, people who had been caught out in the elements, their lives lost in the blink of an eye. His gaze shifted back to the young woman in front of him, the desperation in her eyes clear. "I can't let you stay in the barn," he said after a long pause. "It's not safe." Ada's heart sank. She opened her mouth to beg again, but before she could speak, the cowboy made a small gesture toward the house. "Come on, you can stay inside. Get out of the storm." Her mind couldn't catch up with what was happening. She froze, unsure whether to trust him, unsure if there was some catch to it. She stared at the door, then back at the children. "What do you want in return?" she asked, her voice low and wary. The man didn't hesitate. "Nothing. Just get them inside before the storm hits." For a moment, Ada could only stand there, blinking in disbelief. It wasn't the offer she expected, but there was something in his eyes, something kind, maybe too kind. Still, she couldn't risk thinking too much about it. She could only nod and step forward, guiding the children behind her. She expected him to say something more, to demand something in return, but the man simply turned and led them inside. The door creaked open, and as they stepped over the threshold, Ada couldn't help but feel a strange weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't the safety she had hoped for, but it was something. The man didn't look back as he closed the door behind them, but she caught a glimpse of his face. He was standing just inside the door, his hand on the knob, looking out at the darkening sky. A flicker of something in his eyes. Was it pity? Compassion? Ada couldn't tell. She knew one thing for certain, though. Whatever else happened, they were safe for the night. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The inside of the house was nothing like Ada expected. It was small, just one room with a fire crackling in the hearth, and a single bed tucked against the wall. A simple wooden table sat near the fire, 2 chairs pulled up to it, and shelves lined with books and tools. Everything was clean, functional, and well kept, but there were no delicate touches, no lace curtains or flowers in vases. It was a bachelor's house, plain and practical. Ada could see that immediately. She hesitated as Cole showed them in, leading her and the children to the table. Stew's in the pot, bread's by the stove. Get them fed, he instructed in a calm, matter-of-fact voice, but before Ada could respond, he began stripping blankets from his own bed. She watched, confused and suddenly uneasy. "What are you doing?" she asked. Cole glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Kids need to sleep warm. Bed's the warmest spot." He handed her the blankets, but Ada's pride flared. "Absolutely not," she insisted. "We'll take the floor. It's more than we've had." Cole turned his gaze to the children, and Ada's heart tightened. James was swaying on his feet, barely able to stay awake. Sarah's lips cracked and bleeding, and Tommy was trembling from the cold. The sight of them broke something inside her, and for a moment, she couldn't argue. But when Cole stepped toward the door, coat in hand, preparing to leave, she stepped forward, her voice desperate. "Please, at least take the floor by the fire. We can all fit." Cole paused in the doorway, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You need to feel safe. You want if I'm here." "I know that," he said, his voice low and steady. Without waiting for a response, he walked out into the storm. Ada stood there for a long time, frozen in place, her mind racing. She expected him to return angry, demanding, maybe even drunk, but the minutes stretched into hours, and he didn't come back. The children ate the stew hungrily, their first real meal in days, and as they devoured the food, Ada found herself thinking about how strange this man was. There was nothing familiar about him, nothing that suggested the kind of danger she'd been raised to expect from men. Still, she kept the rifle close by, her hand resting on its cold barrel as she waited for the door to open, her eyes darting to the window every few minutes. She couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. Meanwhile, outside in the barn, Cole lay in the hay loft, his body stiff and cold from the storm. The wind howled around him, rattling the barn's walls, but he couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept returning to the children's faces, their hollow cheeks, their terrified eyes, and to Ada. She reminded him too much of his sister, of the way he had failed her before she died. It was a weakness he'd fought for years, but tonight it crept up on him. He wondered if he'd done the right thing, letting them inside. He had nothing worth stealing, nothing but the horse, but still, what if they took it? What if it was all a trap? The thoughts plagued him, but in the end, he drifted off to sleep, only to be awakened hours later by the fierce wind rattling against the barn. He didn't know why he was so restless, but something about this night felt different. Back in the house, Ada sat in silence, her mind a storm of its own. She had no idea what to expect from the man or his intentions. Every time the door creaked, she flinched, expecting him to return angry or worse, but he never did. She could hear the wind howling outside, the storm rising to a fury, and she couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened to her family if she hadn't found this place. But no matter how much she tried to rest, sleep wouldn't come. She kept imagining her father's rages, The way the saloon owner had grabbed her, the desperation that had led her to steal away in the middle of the night. She wouldn't let herself forget the danger, no matter how kind Cole had been. But at least for tonight, they were safe. When morning came and the first light began to seep through the cracks in the window, Ada was awake, sitting by the fire with the rifle across her lap. She was still waiting, still expecting the worst. But when the barn door creaked open and Cole's boots crossed the threshold, she froze. Her finger found the trigger, her body tense, ready to defend herself and the children. But what he said when he entered the room made her hand go slack, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe. The gray light of dawn barely filtered through the window as Ada sat by the fire, her fingers still curled around the cold metal of the rifle. Her body ached from the long night of watching, waiting, but she hadn't dared let herself sleep. The children, exhausted from the long journey and the strange night, lay huddled in the bed, their breathing slow and even. Ada's mind raced as she thought about the future, what she would do once they left. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, not with the law potentially looking for her, but she had no idea where to go or how to keep the children safe. She was still in the midst of calculating her options when she heard the barn door creak open. Footsteps crunched in the snow, and then the door to the house opened, and Cole stepped inside. His face was red from the cold, and his clothes were dusted with frost. Ada's heart leaped, her grip tightening on the rifle, but Cole didn't seem at all startled by her readiness. Instead, he simply looked at her, then at the rifle in her hands. "That's mine," he said, his voice calm. "But you can keep it if it makes you feel safer." He walked over to the stove, adding a few more logs to the fire, and began preparing a pot of coffee. Ada, still on edge, kept her finger on the trigger, but something in his demeanor, his nonchalant approach to everything, made her hesitate. She didn't understand this man, didn't know if he was a friend or a threat, but as she watched him move around the kitchen, her tension slowly eased. "You slept in the barn," she said, her voice cracking as she finally spoke. "In that storm." Cole shrugged, his back to her, as he sliced a loaf of bread. "I've slept in worse," he replied simply, as if it was nothing. "You hungry?" Ada's stomach clenched, but she didn't answer immediately. It was too much to process, all of it, the bed, the warmth, the food. She had barely been able to think clearly since she arrived. This is wrong," she murmured, her guilt surfacing again. "You shouldn't have to. Bed's just wooden feathers," Cole interrupted, his voice gruff but not unkind. "The kids needed it more than me." Ada felt her heart tug. She had wanted to say something, anything, to refuse his kindness, but she couldn't. She had no right to turn it away, not after everything they'd been through. Cole turned toward her then, holding out a plate of bread and cheese. "Eat. I'll make coffee." Ada took the plate, unsure of what to say. The last few days had blurred together, hunger, fear, and endless walking, but this was something else. She could feel the weight of his words, the unspoken offer of help, of safety, and she didn't know what to do with it. She didn't know if she could trust it. She didn't know if she could trust him. As she began to eat, her mind turned to the future again. "We'll leave after breakfast," she said quietly. "I promise. Thank you for—" "Where are you going?" Cole interrupted her. "West," Ada replied, not looking at him. "Maybe California, somewhere no one knows us." But Cole didn't seem convinced. He didn't say anything at first, just studied her, and then asked, "You got money for that? Supplies? Your wagon's wheel is split." Ada's silence was all the answer he needed. She had nothing. Her last few coins had been spent days ago, and the wagon wouldn't get them anywhere without repair. The cold set in, and the reality of their situation crashed back down on her. She didn't know what to do next, but she couldn't let her siblings suffer any longer. "Let us stay 3 days," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'll work. I'll earn our keep. Then we go." Cole studied her for a long moment, and for a second, Ada thought he might refuse. But then he nodded, slowly, his expression unreadable. 3 days, he said finally. We'll see. He handed her a bucket. Milk the cow. Left stall barn. It was a simple instruction, but Ada's heart sank. She had worked on a farm before, but it had been years. She wasn't sure she could remember everything, but she had no choice. She couldn't ask him for more. She had to prove she could hold up her end of the bargain for the sake of the children. She set her shoulders, feeling a small flicker of resolve deep inside. She would do this. She would make them safe. And maybe, just maybe, if she worked hard enough, if she proved herself, she could earn the right to stay. Cole watched her from the fence as she worked, his eyes steady, but he didn't say anything. He just let her get on with it, milking the cow, feeding the chickens, collecting the eggs. She was stiff at first, but soon the rhythm of the chores started to feel familiar again, like a piece of her old life she had almost forgotten. The children came out after a while, sleepy but hungry, and they helped in their own way. Tommy held the hammer for Cole as he worked on the fence. Sarah swept the porch without being asked, and James, too young to be of much help, stacked small pieces of kindling. Ada watched them as they worked, a pang of guilt stabbing her. She wasn't supposed to be their mother. She wasn't supposed to be the one holding everything together. But somehow, in this strange place with this strange man, she was. And in that moment, with the sun rising higher in the sky and the warmth of the fire filling the room, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And as they sat down for the midday meal, a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apples, Ada looked at Cole and realized that, for the first time in weeks, she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to live again. It was the fourth day, late in the afternoon, when Ada first saw the dust cloud rising from the horizon, the sign of someone approaching. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew it wasn't just any traveler. It was someone who had business with them. Her breath caught in her throat as she spotted a lone rider on horseback, his silhouette cutting through the fading sunlight. Ada's first instinct was panic. She ran inside, calling the children to hide. Upstairs. Now, don't make a sound, she ordered, her voice barely above a whisper as she rushed them toward the small loft space. With trembling hands, she threw blankets over them, hoping they would stay still, their wide eyes full of confusion and fear. She couldn't let them see what was coming. As she scrambled back down, her eyes met Cole's, and she saw in his face that he understood immediately. He was already walking toward the door, moving with purpose, as if he'd been expecting this moment. Stay quiet, he told her, his voice steady and calm despite the rising tension. He didn't wait for her to respond before stepping out into the yard, and Ada quickly followed him, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. The rider, now dismounting, had a badge on his chest, and Ada's stomach sank. She knew exactly what that meant. A marshal. The rider approached with slow, deliberate steps, his face weathered and stern. "Afternoon. You Cole Mitchell?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Cole nodded, not giving anything away. "I am. What can I do for you, Marshal?" he replied, his tone casual, but Ada could hear the edge of caution in it. The marshal squinted at him, then glanced past, his eyes flicking over the house, the barn, the children's clothes on the line. "I'm looking for a young woman, early 20s, with 3 children. Ages 6 to 10, the marshal said, his voice cool and professional. Ada's breath hitched in her throat as she silently cursed herself for not being more careful. Cole didn't flinch. He just studied the marshal for a moment before responding, his voice calm, almost bored. "That's specific. What did she do?" he asked, though Ada could see the tension in his jaw. The marshal's eyes narrowed. "Theft. Stole a wagon and horse from her father in Missouri. He's offering a reward for her capture." Cole's lip curled in disgust at the mention of the father, and Ada could see the muscles in his neck tighten. But he said nothing. The marshal, however, wasn't done. "You see anyone like that pass through here?" he asked, his gaze locking onto Cole. "I don't know," Cole replied flatly. "I'm pretty isolated out here." Ada's heart was pounding in her chest, her breath shallow as she prayed the marshal wouldn't ask any more questions. She was certain he was suspicious. "Mind if I look around?" the marshal asked, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Just routine. Make sure the kids are okay." Ada's throat went dry. She glanced at Cole, but his expression remained unreadable. "You got a warrant?" he asked, his voice firm, though Ada could hear the faintest trace of worry in it. The marshal's eyes flicked to him, a small smirk crossing his lips. "Don't need one for a welfare check. Those kids might be in danger." The words hung in the air like a threat. The marshal stepped forward, and Cole stood his ground, his body tense. Ada felt a surge of panic. She had to get the children out of sight. She couldn't risk them being discovered. Not now. The marshal began his search, stepping closer to the house. His boots crunched in the snow as he walked toward the porch, peering through the window. He could see the children's shoes scattered by the door, the small bowls on the table, and the clothes drying on the line. His eyes narrowed. "Those look like children's clothes," he said, pointing at the laundry. "My sister's kids visit sometimes. She lives over in Silver Creek," Cole explained, his voice steady but sharp, as though daring the marshal to challenge him. The marshal didn't respond immediately, instead making his way toward the ladder that led up to the loft. Ada's stomach dropped as the marshal's foot hovered just over the first rung. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the panic rising in her chest, but Cole spoke before she could do anything. "Marshal," he said, his voice low but commanding, "you're welcome to look, but I'm telling you, there's nobody here but me." The marshal hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking between Cole and the loft door, but something in Cole's eyes made him pause. With a grunt, he turned and began walking back to the door. "I believe you've seen this woman, and I believe you're hiding something," the marshal said, his voice sharp now. Cole didn't flinch. He simply met the marshal's gaze and said, "Believe what you want." The marshal lingered a moment longer, eyeing him as if trying to decide whether or not to push further, but eventually he nodded curtly. "Harboring a fugitive is a crime, Mr. Mitchell. Prison time." Cole's voice was steady as he responded, "I'm aware of the law." The marshal's eyes narrowed, his suspicion still lingering, but it didn't push further. "Her father's got connections. He'll be looking for her. If you see anyone matching that description, you let me know," he said, his voice cool. "I'll be back in a week, with a warrant if I need one." Without waiting for a response, the marshal turned and walked back to his horse, his boots crunching in the snow. As he mounted up and rode off, Ada felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. But the relief was only temporary. The marshal had warned them, and she knew that this was far from over. When Cole turned back toward her, his face unreadable, Ada could only stare at him, her thoughts a whirl of fear and uncertainty. The danger was closer than ever, and she had no idea what would happen next. It had been a week since the marshal's visit, and the tension in the air hadn't lifted. Cole had kept his word, go to town first to file a false marriage certificate with the clerk, backdating it 3 months, making it official on paper, but still a lie. He returned with the certificate in hand, showing it to Ada. Her new name felt foreign in her mouth, but it was their only option if they were to stay hidden. She glanced at the document, the weight of what it represented settling heavily in her chest. The plan was simple enough. They would tell people they had met a year ago, exchanged letters, and gotten married quietly. Ada had brought her siblings because they had nowhere else to go. The story was believable, except for the part where it wasn't. Ada's heart fluttered with uncertainty, but she knew they had no other choice. The decision was made, and they would ride into town the next day to make the story real to anyone who asked. That night, they rehearsed their answers to questions that were sure to come. Ada had to master the details, from when they'd met to when they'd been married. The children practiced calling Cole by his first name, not Sir, though Sarah kept slipping up, nervously calling him Mr. Cole instead. By morning, Ada dressed carefully, her hair pinned up and her new dress as neat as she could manage, though it was still a bit too big for her. She noticed that Cole had also cleaned up, his usual cowboy attire replaced by a fresh shirt, his hat positioned neatly atop his head. The entire family piled into the wagon, Cole, Ada, and the 3 children, and began the 3-hour ride to town. The air was crisp and cold, the snow still thick in places, but the sun had finally started to show signs of breaking through the winter gloom. The children were nervous, eyes wide as they passed by familiar sights, but everything felt unfamiliar now, even to Ada. As they entered the town, she saw the stairs, the whispers that followed them down the dirt road. The small frontier town had few distractions, and every person who passed seemed to stop and take notice. The general store was the first stop. Mrs. Brennan, the shopkeeper, greeted them with a cold, calculating look. "Cole, didn't know you'd gotten married," she said, her eyes flicking over Ada and the children. Cole responded with his usual calm, introducing Ada as his wife, her siblings as her children. Mrs. Brennan's sharp eyes didn't miss the small details. Ada's slightly out-of-place dress, the fact that the children were clearly nervous. "Where you from, dear?" she asked, her tone clipped. Ada, her voice practiced, answered, "Missouri originally. Met Cole last year." The other women in the store, a few gathered around the counter, leaned in, their eyes scanning Ada as though she was some sort of puzzle to be solved. "Awfully young, aren't you?" one asked, a thin smile on her lips. "3 children already? My, you've been busy." Ada smiled weakly, unsure of how to respond. Another woman piped up, "Funny we never saw you courting." Ada's throat tightened. She had to keep the story straight. "We wrote letters," she said, glancing at Cole for support. Didn't need the whole town watching. It was a half-truth, but it was the best she could manage. Cole stepped closer to her, placing a hand on hers, and for the first time, she felt a slight easing of the tension in her chest. He wasn't just her protector now. He was part of the story, part of their story, and she had to trust it. As they picked up their supplies, flour, sugar, lamp oil, nails, Ada tried to focus on the task at hand, but she couldn't ignore the growing whispers around her. Her mind kept racing, calculating, wondering if someone would see through the facade. Outside, as they prepared to leave, James tripped on the boardwalk, scraping his knee. He started to cry, but before Ada could move to comfort him, Cole swooped in, lifting him gently into his arms and wiping his tears away with a handkerchief. "You're all right, buddy. Just a scratch," Cole murmured, his voice soft and reassuring. The women who had been watching, whispering only moments before, fell silent as they took in the tenderness of the moment. One of them whispered, "Maybe it's real after all." Ada watched Cole as he carried James back to the wagon, his large hands steady and sure, and she couldn't help but feel something inside her stir. She wasn't sure if it was relief or fear or something else entirely, but it was there deep in her chest. As they made their way back to the wagon, her stomach twisted with the unease of what lay ahead. They had fooled the townspeople for now, but with the marshals still on the lookout, it was only a matter of time before someone came asking questions again. Just as they started down the road back to the ranch, she spotted a familiar figure, Marshal Thompson, standing near the saloon, his eyes watching them closely. Her heart stopped. She was sure that he knew, that he was watching for something to give them away. She could feel the sweat forming on the back of her neck, the pressure of the lie heavy on her shoulders. But Cole didn't seem worried. He kept his eyes ahead, his grip steady on the reins, and the children sat quietly in the back, their faces still anxious but trying to appear calm. Ada didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain. She couldn't keep running forever. The past was catching up with her, and no matter how hard she tried to escape it, it was always just around the corner. The ride back was quiet, the weight of their journey settling in as they neared the ranch. And as they pulled up to the house, Ada's hand unconsciously went to her finger, where the ring still sat, an unspoken reminder of the choice she had made. The snow had begun to melt, and with the change in the weather came a shift in the mood around the ranch. Spring, though still distant, was inching its way forward, the earth softening underfoot and the air smelling of the promise of warmer days. Ada had recovered fully from the fever that had gripped her weeks earlier, though she still carried the weight of the past with her. She'd been working alongside Cole as much as she could, trying to keep herself busy and not think too hard about the uncertainty that still lingered like a shadow over them. The children had settled in as well, their laughter returning more each day as they got used to the rhythm of ranch life. Tommy had grown more confident in his work, taking up the responsibility of looking after the animals, while Sarah had started helping Ada with the cooking, her small hands learning to knead dough and chop vegetables. James had found a new hobby in carving small wooden animals, his creations becoming more intricate with each passing week. The house, which had once felt cold and unfamiliar, now felt like home. Even though the bed in the main room had been meant for her and Cole, Ada had started to feel more at ease there. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Cole would read aloud to the children the stories of the Old West that were new to them, but had become a familiar comfort for Ada. As time passed, Cole seemed to find ways to spend more time with the children, teaching Tommy how to ride, showing Sarah how to tend to the garden, and even giving James one of his old knives so he could continue his carving. Ada, though grateful for the changes, couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, something she wasn't seeing. She hadn't asked Cole about his past, not directly, but the way he had spoken about his family, how he had lived alone for so long, made her wonder about the things he hadn't shared. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as they were finishing dinner and the children had gone off to bed, that the question finally slipped from her lips. "Cole," she began, her voice quiet but deliberate. "How did you end up here? I mean, you said you were alone for a long time, but why? What happened?" The question caught him off guard, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the fire, his expression unreadable. Ada held her breath, waiting for him to respond, and when he did, his voice was low, filled with something that sounded almost like regret. "I had a family once," he said slowly. "A sister. Younger. 7 years old when she died. Scarlet fever. It took her quickly. We couldn't do anything for her." His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he continued. "My mother. She didn't survive it either. She never got over losing my sister. A year later, she died too. After that, it was just me and my father. But my father wasn't much of a man anymore. He drank, gambled. By the time I was 16, he drank himself to death, and I was left to figure it all out alone." He paused, as if lost in the memory. Ada could see the pain in his eyes, the things he wasn't saying. "I left home, came out here, built this ranch from nothing. I thought maybe if I worked hard enough, if I kept myself busy, it would all go away. But it didn't." Ada sat in silence, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She could feel the rawness of his grief, the way it had shaped him, and for the first time, she understood why he kept so much of himself hidden. "I know what it's like," he continued, his voice tight, "to lose everything, to be alone. Sometimes it's easier to stay that way. No one to lose, nothing to miss." Ada's chest ached. She didn't know what to say. She had felt that same loneliness too, after her mother died. She had tried to protect her siblings from the same kind of pain, to keep them safe from the world. But Cole's loss had been different. He had lost everyone. His family, his home, his hope. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted between them. For the first time, the walls he had built around himself seemed to crack. "It's all right," he said, though his voice was strained. "It's been a long time, and I've learned to live with it. I'm not asking for sympathy." Ada nodded, understanding more than he could know. She didn't need him to explain his past. She could see it in his eyes. But as the silence stretched between them, something else lingered in the air, something unspoken, a feeling that neither of them had acknowledged before. It wasn't just the past they were sharing. It was the present, the connection they had built over the past few months. Ada wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, she had stopped pretending. She had stopped seeing Cole as just a stranger who had helped her out of a desperate situation. He had become something more, someone who had shown her what it meant to be cared for, someone who had made her believe for the first time in a long while that she could trust again. She didn't know what that meant for them, or what would come next, but she knew it was something that couldn't be ignored. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of a different kind of hope, not just for her and her siblings, but for herself. As if the life she had been running from could finally be left behind, replaced by something new, something real. I didn't know how to love anyone after my sister died, Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the words hit Ada hard. I thought it would be easier this way. No one to care about, no one to worry about. But I was wrong. It doesn't work that way. Not really. Ada's eyes searched his face, looking for the truth in the depths of his gaze. He had been closed off for so long, and now he was letting her see the parts of himself that he had kept buried. She could feel the shift, the way the world around them seemed to slow down, to fade into the background as they both sat there, caught in the moment. You don't have to be alone anymore, Ada said softly, her voice steady despite the flutter of uncertainty in her chest. Not if you don't want to be. The words hung in the air, full of promise, full of vulnerability. For the first time in months, she wasn't just talking about survival. She was talking about living, about choosing to be part of something bigger than herself. Cole didn't respond right away, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet, but she could see it there. The beginning of something new, something neither of them had expected. The past was always going to be a part of them, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something together. A future. When the silence finally broke, it wasn't with words, but with a simple gesture. Cole stood up, walked over to the door, and paused before turning back to look at her. I'm not used to this, he said quietly, a small, uncertain smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But maybe I can get used to it. Ada's heart gave a small leap, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a deep, quiet certainty that she had found her place. Not just here on the ranch, but with him, together. They had both been running from their past for so long, but now it seemed like they were finally ready to face the future, whatever it might hold. The children's laughter echoed from the other room, and for a brief moment, everything felt right. In that instant, Ada knew they had both found something they weren't looking for, a family. And no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it as long as they were together. It was late afternoon when the three riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes barely visible against the golden sky. The ranch, nestled in the valley, had always felt isolated, distant from the world, as if nothing could touch them here. But now, as Ada watched the riders approach from the porch, her stomach dropped. The air was thick with foreboding, the wind carrying the scent of something ominous. Cole had been inside, helping Sarah with her reading, while Tommy and James were outside, tending to the animals. Ada's hand instinctively went to the small pistol Cole had given her when they first arrived. It was a comfort, but it was also a reminder of how vulnerable they still were. She knew who the riders were before they even reached the gate. They were the same men who had threatened them before, the men who had come looking for Cole years ago. Jack Dawson and his gang. She had seen the way Cole's face had tightened when he first mentioned them, the way he looked over his shoulder as if he could still feel the danger hanging in the air. He had told her about them before, the gang he had helped send to prison, how they had sworn revenge on him for testifying against them. They had been hunting him ever since, and now it seemed they had finally tracked him down. Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned toward the house, looking for Cole. But he wasn't there. He had gone to the barn to check on the livestock. Ada's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she ran inside, calling the children. Get inside now, she shouted, her voice trembling. They had to hide. They had no other choice. There was no time to think, no time to reason. Upstairs. Hide in the loft. Don't make a sound, she ordered as she pushed the children toward the ladder. James clung to her, his eyes wide with fear. "What's happening, Ada?" he asked, his voice small. "Nothing to worry about. Just go," she whispered, trying to calm him. She couldn't afford to show her fear now, not when they needed her the most. She made sure the children were hidden, then grabbed the rifle from the wall, her fingers shaking as she checked the chamber. She didn't know if it would be enough to protect them, but it was all she had. She ran back outside, just as the riders reached the gate. Cole had emerged from the barn by then, standing tall and still, his eyes locked on the three men who were now dismounting. Ada could see the tension in his posture, the way he held himself like a man who knew what was coming. She wanted to run to him, to beg him to come inside, but she knew better. These were his ghosts, his past catching up to him. She had to trust him to handle it, but that didn't make it any easier. The leader of the group, Jack Dawson, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a cruel smile, looked Cole up and down, his eyes narrowing. Well, Cole Mitchell. Or should I say, Cole Brennan. Dawson said, his voice dripping with mockery. Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Dawson," he replied, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. Ada stood on the porch, her heart pounding as she listened to the exchange. She couldn't hear all of it, but she could see the way Dawson's men stood around Cole, their hands resting on their weapons. It wasn't a standoff, at least not yet, but it was close. "We've been looking for you for a long time," Dawson continued, his voice low and dangerous. "Took us a while, but we found you. And now, well, we've got business." He glanced over at the house, his eyes flicking to the porch where Ada was standing. "Nice little setup you got here. Pretty wife, cute kids. Be a shame if something happened to them." Cole's hand shifted on the rifle slung across his back, and Ada could see the tension in his posture. "I'm not leaving with you," he said calmly, his eyes fixed on Dawson. "You're not taking me anywhere." Dawson's grin widened. "You've got a choice, Cole. Come with us peacefully, and we'll leave them alone. Fight us, and we'll burn it all down. With them inside." Ada felt a cold chill run through her veins. She could see the way Dawson's men were moving, their eyes calculating, waiting for Cole to make a decision. The fear for her children, for everything they had worked for, almost paralyzed her. But she couldn't let it. She couldn't let them take everything. She glanced at the rifle in her hands, then back at the children who were hidden upstairs. Her heart twisted. She couldn't lose them, not now. Not when they had just started to find something that resembled a home. She didn't know what to do, but then she remembered the old saying Cole had told her when they first met. Sometimes you just have to act. And that's exactly what she did. Stepping out from behind the barn, her pistol aimed at Dawson, she spoke, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "Drop it," she commanded. Dawson turned, startled by her sudden appearance, his men momentarily distracted. "The little wife," he chuckled, clearly not taking her seriously. But Ada didn't waver. She kept the gun aimed at him, her hands steady. "I said drop it," she repeated, her voice firm. The men paused, their eyes flicking between each other and Cole. Jack Dawson, still laughing, made a small gesture to his men to lower their weapons. "You really think you can stop me, sweetheart?" he sneered. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. You think you can take us all on?" "I don't have to take you all on," Ada said quietly, her voice cold. "I just have to make sure you don't get any closer." As she spoke, Tommy, who had somehow slipped out of the loft, rang the emergency bell on the ranch, the sharp, high-pitched sound echoing through the valley. The sound carried, and Dawson's men froze, confused by the sudden noise. "What's that for?" Dawson asked, narrowing his eyes. "Neighbors," Cole replied, his voice calm but full of authority. "If they hear that bell, they'll be here in minutes." It was a bluff. There were no neighbors nearby, and the closest one was miles away. But Dawson didn't know that. The three men looked around, uncertain, their gazes shifting nervously. Dawson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Ada thought they were going to charge. But then, he seemed to reconsider, looking over his shoulder at his men. He weighed his options. A standoff here could mean trouble, especially with the law already suspicious of Cole. If anything happened, He knew the marshal would be on his trail. "This isn't over," Dawson muttered, turning to his men. "We'll be back." With that, they mounted their horses and rode off into the fading light. Ada stood there for a long moment, the weight of the situation settling into her bones. She had done it. She had saved them for now. But as the dust settled and the sound of hooves faded, Cole walked toward her, his eyes hard but filled with a strange kind of gratitude. "You could have been killed," he said quietly, his voice tight with fear. Ada didn't respond immediately. She was still trying to steady her breath, to make sense of the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "So could you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Slowly, the children emerged from their hiding place. Tommy's face pale, Sarah's eyes wide with fear, but both of them trying to be brave. James clung to his older sister's side, his small body trembling. They gathered on the porch, their faces full of questions, of terror, but also of a quiet sense of relief. But there was no time to explain. "We can't stay here," Ada said, her voice urgent. "They'll come back. We have to leave tonight." Cole shook his head, his eyes locking with hers. "You're not leaving." Ada looked at him, confusion and fear written across her face. "You heard him. He'll come back. He knows we're here." But Cole's face was steady, resolute. "Then we make sure your story holds up." The words hit her like a bolt of lightning. And for the first time, Ada saw the plan in Cole's eyes. He wasn't just going to let them get taken. He was going to fight for them. "I'll turn myself in," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Tell the marshal everything. It's the only way." The idea struck Ada like a storm, and her stomach churned. "No," she said, shaking her head, her voice shaking. "If you go to prison, we'll be separated. You don't have to do this." "I have to," Cole said, "but not alone. We'll go together." They would face it together, the truth, the law, the danger. It was the only way forward, the only way they could stop running. And maybe, just maybe, they would find their freedom in the end.